The access controller on parking level 3 logged a badge tap at 2:47 a.m. Badge 4412. I looked up the name in the old hospital directory that still lived on the security terminal, cached in a system nobody had bothered to wipe. Dr. Helen Marsh, emergency medicine. She died in the P3 stairwell 4 years ago. Cardiac arrest. They found her on the landing between P3 and P2, still in her white coat, still holding her car keys. Her badge was collected by HR, deactivated in the system, and run through the crosscut shredder per hospital policy. Badge 4412 doesn't exist anymore, but the access controller on P3 logged it tapping in at 2:47 a.m. I need to back up. My name's Hank Jessup. I'm 59 years old. I worked the parking garage at Mercy Regional Medical Center for 22 years. Not security, parking. I was the guy in the booth at the entrance to P1, the one who'd wave you through if your badge worked and write your plate number on a clipboard if it didn't. I knew every doctor's car. I knew which nurses parked on which level by habit. I knew the oil stains on the concrete by shape, like a man knows the freckles on his own arms. When they automated the lot in 2017, they kept me on as a parking enforcement officer, which was a polite way of saying I walked around with a chalk stick marking tires and writing tickets nobody ever paid. When Mercy closed entirely in 2021, the new regional health system built a campus across town and absorbed everything. I took the overnight security contract because nobody else wanted it. Also because I didn't want to stop coming here. My wife Carol died at Mercy Regional. Pancreatic cancer. Dr. Marsh was the ER attending the night we brought her in. I don't talk about that part. That's not what this is about. The overnight shift is 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 8 hours alone in a dead hospital campus. The main building is 5 stories of empty hallways, stripped exam rooms, and disconnected monitors still bolted to swing arms. The parking structure sits underneath and beside it, 3 levels underground, concrete and rebar, fluorescent tubes on 60-minute timers that click off if nothing moves. My routine was simple. Arrive at 10, check in on the terminal at the front security desk, make 4 rounds, midnight, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., 5:30. Each round takes about 40 minutes. Walk the main building floors, check the door seals, check the locks, then down through the parking structure, P1, P2, P3, back to the desk, coffee, read the access logs, wait for Phil, the day guy, to show up at 6. The access logs were a habit I couldn't break. 22 years of checking who badged in and who badged out, watching the digital list scroll on the terminal, making sure the numbers made sense. At Mercy, I could tell you the daily rhythm of the hospital just from the badge log. The 6 a.m. nursing shift change, the 7 a.m. attending rush, the janitorial crew at 9 p.m. Now the log was empty. Just my own badge entry at 10 p.m. and my exit at 6 a.m. 2 lines, every day, until it wasn't. I'd been on the contract about 8 months when I noticed the entries. I was scrolling through the log on a slow Tuesday night, drinking coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago, and I saw lines I'd never seen before. Badge 4412 Marsh Helen R. Access granted. P3 entry gate. I stared at it, scrolled back to the previous day. Same entry, same time, same badge. I scrolled further. The day before that, and before that. Going back weeks, maybe longer. The log only stored 90 days, and every single night, right there between my 2 a.m. round log and whatever came next, was badge 4412 tapping the P3 entry gate at 2:47 a.m. I should tell you something about how badge access systems work, because this is important. The reader on the gate is an RFID proximity unit. The badge has a chip in it. You hold the badge near the reader picks up the chip's signal, sends the badge number to the access controller. The controller checks its database, and if the badge is valid, it triggers the gate arm motor. That's it. No badge, no signal, no log entry. And badge 4412 was deactivated in the system 4 years ago. Deactivated means the controller should reject it, even if someone held the physical badge to the reader. But the log said access granted. The controller wasn't just seeing the badge, it was authorizing it. I told myself it was a system artifact. The hospital's access control server was still technically running on a UPS battery backup because the security company hadn't been paid to decommission it properly. Legacy data cycling. Cached entries from years ago somehow re-indexing with current timestamps. I'd seen stranger things from old hospital IT systems. Monitors that turned themselves on, nurse call buttons that chimed in empty rooms, the ancient pneumatic tube system that still wheezed air through the walls even though nobody had loaded a canister in 3 years. I emailed the security company, typed it up professional, the way you write a maintenance request. Getting ghost entries on the P3 gate controller. Badge 4412, nightly at 2:47. Please advise. They replied the next afternoon. Legacy data artifact. System decommissioned scheduled Q3. Ignore. So I ignored it. For about a week. Then I went down to P3 during my 3 a.m. round, which I normally did anyway, and I stopped at the entry gate. The gate arm was zip-tied in the down position. 2 heavy-duty black zip ties cinching the arm to the vertical post so it couldn't rise. The motor cable was unplugged, coiled on the floor beside the controller box like a dead snake. The badge reader mounted on the entry post was dark. No power LED, no standby light. The housing had a fine layer of concrete dust on it, undisturbed. Everything was physically dead. The system that was logging badge 4412 every night at 2:47 a.m. was connected to hardware that had no power, no signal path, and no physical capability of reading anything. I stood there in the fluorescent flicker. P3 only had about 1/3 of its tubes still working, and they gave everything a greenish swimming quality, like being underwater. And I looked at the gate arm, at the zip ties. The zip ties were scored, not cut. Scored, friction marks. The black plastic had white stress lines running along the inner edge. The kind of marks you get when something pulls against a zip tie repeatedly. Not hard enough to snap it, but hard enough to stretch the locking mechanism. One of the ties had elongated maybe 1/4 inch. The plastic gone pale and slightly translucent, where the molecular structure had distorted under sustained force. Something had been pulling against those zip ties, regularly, for a long time. I replaced them. Took 2 fresh ties from the kit on my belt. I always carried zip ties, electrical tape, a multi-tool, same kit I'd carried as a parking attendant, and cinched the arm down tight. Double looped the second one for good measure. Pulled them until my fingers went white. That arm wasn't going anywhere. Went back to the desk, drank the last of my cold coffee, watched the terminal. At 2:47 a.m. the log entry appeared. 2:47, badge 4412, Marsh Helen R., access granted, P3 entry gate. I sat there looking at the screen for a long time. The fluorescent tube above the desk buzzed. The vending machine in the hallway behind me hummed its low electric hymn. Outside, somewhere far above the concrete and the dirt and the parking structure, a truck downshifted on the highway. I printed the log page, folded it, put it in my shirt pocket. Then I wrote the time in my round log and kept going, because that's what you do. You write it down and you keep going. 22 years in a parking garage teaches you that. The building does what it does. You just write it down. I started documenting, not because the security company asked me to, they'd already told me to ignore it, but because I was a parking guy. Parking guys count things. We count cars, we count spaces, we count badge taps. It's what we do. If there's a number that doesn't belong, we circle it, and we keep circling it until somebody explains it. Every night for 11 straight nights, I watched the terminal at 2:47 a.m. Every night the entry appeared. Same badge, same name, same gate, access granted. I wrote each one down in a pocket notebook I bought at the gas station on my way to shift. Date, time, badge number, name. 11 entries, 11 perfect duplicates. On the 12th night, I looked up Dr. Helen Marsh. The old hospital directory was still cached on the security terminal. HR records, department rosters, badge assignments, all of it frozen in place from the day they shut the servers down. It took me a while to find her. The search function was slow, the way old systems get when nobody maintains them, like a car engine that hasn't turned over in years. Helen Ruth Marsh, MD, Emergency Medicine, badge 4412, hired 2011, status, deceased. Date of death, March 14, 2019. Notes, found unresponsive on P3 stairwell landing by morning security officer M. Dominguez at 6:14 a.m. Cause of death, sudden cardiac arrest. Personal vehicle, silver Honda Accord, plate TN 447 HRM, recovered from space P327. I knew that space. P327. Third row from the stairwell, right side. I'd written tickets on cars in that space 100 times. I could picture the oil stain on the concrete. Every space on P3 had one, each a slightly different shape, like fingerprints. P327's looked like a comma. She died in the stairwell, between P3 and P2, walking to her car after a shift probably, or walking from her car to start one. The record didn't say which direction she was heading. Just that Marcus Dominguez found her on the landing at 6:14 in the morning, and by then there was nothing anyone could do. I thought about that for a while. A doctor who spent her career keeping people alive, dying alone in a concrete stairwell in a parking garage. Nobody heard her fall. Nobody heard anything. The stairwell is concrete and steel. Sounds don't carry out of it, they just bounce around inside, getting smaller and smaller until they disappear. I know because I used to eat my lunch in those stairwells during summer when the booth got too hot. You could hear your own chewing echo off the walls. Now here's where it stopped being a software glitch. The parking gate arm has a strain gauge. It's a mechanical sensor, a small spring-loaded plate built into the arm housing that measures physical force. Every commercial parking gate has one. It's required by code, installed so the arm won't close on a vehicle. If the arm hits resistance, a car hood, a roof rack, anything, the strain gauge registers the force and the controller reverses the motor. Simple safety feature, completely mechanical, has nothing to do with the badge reader or the access software. I pulled the strain gauge data from the controller's onboard memory. The controller stores 90 days of sensor data in a local buffer, separate from the access log. I'd never had reason to check it before. Strain gauge data is maintenance territory, not security, but I knew the menu path from my parking days. I scrolled through the data logs and there it was, micro spikes at 2:47 a.m. every night. Not large. The readings showed 0.3 psi of force applied to the gate arm for approximately 4 seconds, then released. Consistent across every logged instance. Something was physically pushing against the gate arm at the exact moment the access controller logged badge 4412. Not a software ghost, not cached data. Physical force on a mechanical sensor registered by hardware that has no connection to the badge system, no connection to the network, no way to be spoofed or corrupted by legacy database entries. The zip ties I'd put on were still intact. I checked. Whatever was pressing against the arm wasn't pressing hard enough to snap them. Just testing them. I set up my phone on P3 the next night, propped it against the base of a concrete column, angled at the gate arm, recording video. Went back to the desk, let it run. Reviewed the footage the next morning in my car before driving home. 4 hours of empty parking garage, green-tinged fluorescent light, concrete, silence. At 2:47 a.m. on the timestamp, nothing happened. The gate arm didn't move, no shadow, no figure, no sound, nothing. But the access log showed the entry at 2:47 a.m., and the strain gauge data showed the 0.3 psi spike at the same second. The camera saw nothing. The sensors saw something. That weekend, I came in early, 3 hours before my shift, while Phil was still on day duty, and went down to P3 with a screwdriver kit. I opened the badge reader housing, took the cover off carefully, the way you'd open a watch. Inside, everything was standard. Circuit board, antenna coil, connector block. But the antenna cable, the coaxial line that connects the RFID antenna to the processor board, was cut. Physically cut. Someone had taken wire cutters to it during decommission, snipped it clean, and left the two ends hanging loose inside the housing. There was no hardware path for any signal to reach the controller. Even if you held a working badge against the reader couldn't read it. The antenna was severed. It was like trying to make a phone call with the cord cut. I photographed everything, closed the housing, went upstairs. Phil was at the front desk eating a sandwich. I asked him casual if he knew anything about the previous night guy, the one before me. Phil stopped chewing, looked at his sandwich like it had said something to him. Then he said he quit, didn't call, just stopped showing up. I asked if he knew why. Phil said no. He left his stuff in the booth, though, his thermos and a notebook. He was writing things down about P3. I asked where the notebook was. Phil said the security company picked it up. He didn't know what was in it. I didn't push, but I noticed Phil didn't eat the rest of his sandwich. That night, during my 2 a.m. round, I went to the P3 stairwell. The stairwell where they found Dr. Marsh. The door was heavy, fireproof, with a magnetic contact sensor on the frame that reported to the security system whether it was open or closed. I pushed through it and stepped inside. Concrete walls, metal handrail. The overhead light was burned out. I used my flashlight. The landing between P3 and P2 was bare. Nothing on the floor, nothing on the walls except a metal bracket at waist height, the mounting point for the emergency call phone. The handset had been removed in 2020 during decommission. Just the bracket remained, bolted to the concrete, with a short length of telephone cable dangling from the junction box behind it. Dead wire going nowhere. I touched the bracket. Cold. Colder than the wall around it, which didn't make sense. Metal and concrete should equalize in temperature in an enclosed space, but the bracket felt like it had been in a refrigerator. I left the stairwell, finished my round, sat at the desk, drank my coffee, waited. At 2:47 a.m., the desk intercom crackled. One tone, sharp, electronic. The kind of sound an intercom makes when a station connects, that brief handshake beep before someone speaks. I looked at the intercom panel. It was an old iPhone unit, hardwired with labeled station buttons. Most of the labels had faded to white, but the display, a small LED readout that showed which station was calling, lit up. P3 stairwell emergency phone, the phone that had been removed 2 years ago. The handset that was sitting in a decommission bin somewhere or in a landfill or melted down. The cable that went nowhere. That station had just connected to my desk and sent a tone through the speaker. I stared at the display until it went dark. It stayed lit for about 6 seconds, then blinked off. No voice, no follow-up, just the tone, the station ID, and silence. The vending machine hummed. The fluorescent tube buzzed. Somewhere above me, the building settled, and a pipe knocked once inside a wall. I didn't go back to P3 that night. I sat at the desk until 6 a.m. and waited for Phil. I almost didn't go in that night. Kept thinking about the intercom tone. Kept seeing that LED display behind my eyelids. P3 stairwell, emergency phone, glowing in flat red, the color of a brake light in fog. But then I thought about the notebook, the one the previous guard left behind, the one Phil said he was keeping about P3. Nobody had mentioned any of it to me when I took the contract. At 2:20 a.m., I made a decision. I was going to be on P3 at 2:47, not watching a screen, not reading a log, standing there next to the gate arm. The cameras saw nothing, and the sensors saw something, and I needed to know which one was telling the truth. I took the stairs, flashlight in my left hand, radio on my belt. P1 still had working fluorescence. P2 had fewer, flickering in a slow, arrhythmic pulse like a heartbeat that can't find its rhythm. P3 had nothing. I stepped off the bottom of the ramp into darkness. My flashlight cut a cone of white through the black air. The beam caught concrete columns, empty spaces, the yellow paint of the lane markings. The air was cold. Always colder on P3. Always had been. Even when the hospital was alive and there were cars down here. Something about the depth, the rock behind the walls. The fact that P3 sits partially below the water table and the concrete sweats year-round. I walked to the entry gate. The zip ties I'd replaced were tight, black, undamaged. The badge reader housing was dusty and dark. The motor cable coiled on the floor. 2:35 a.m. I stood there, listened. The silence on P3 isn't like silence anywhere else. It's the presence of concrete, 3 stories of earth above you pressing down. Sound doesn't travel. It just sits there with you in the cold. 2:44 a.m. I heard something from deeper in the garage. A sound like a car door closing. Soft. Muffled. The way it sounds when you're 3 rows away and someone shuts their door gently. But there were no cars on P3. Hadn't been in 3 years. 2:45 a.m. My radio was quiet. The air was still. I kept my light on the gate arm. 2:46 a.m. The badge reader chirped. One sound, one short electronic tone, like a sparrow trapped in a tin can. I swung the flashlight to the reader. The housing was dark. No LED, no power indicator. The dust on the surface was undisturbed, but the sound had come from inside it, from the severed antenna, the dead circuit board, the hardware that couldn't produce a signal because the wire was physically cut. I heard it. It was real. 2:47 a.m. The gate arm moved. Not slowly. It shuddered, a convulsive jerk, like a muscle spasm. The zip ties creaked, a high, tight sound like guitar strings being tuned too far. Then one snapped. The crack was enormous in the silence, a gunshot echo that bounced off every wall and column and came back to me from 6 directions. The arm rose maybe 6 inches, straining against the remaining tie, the metal groaning and held there, quivering, suspended, for 4 seconds. Then it settled back down with a dull thud that I felt through the floor. I didn't move. I couldn't. My flashlight was shaking, not because I was scared, because my hands were vibrating. Some part of my body had decided to shake and hadn't asked permission. Then the radio. My radio crackled. Not the security channel, channel 3, the one the company used. A different frequency. Static first, the hissing white noise of an open line, and then a voice. A woman's voice, calm. Tired, the way someone sounds at the end of a double shift when they've been on their feet for 16 hours and they just want to sit down. I can't find my car. 3 seconds of static. Then the line closed. I ran. Not away. Toward the stairwell. Toward the P3 stairwell door. I don't know why. Something in the voice pulled me there, the same way a sound in the night pulls your head toward the window before you've decided to look. The stairwell door was closed. Heavy. Fireproof. The magnetic contact sensor on the frame, the one that reports open or closed to the security system. I checked my radio display. It read, P3 stairwell door, open. I was looking at the door. It was closed. The sensor said open. I pushed through it, flashlight up. The stairwell was empty. Concrete walls, metal handrail, the landing where they'd found Dr. Marsh 5 years ago. Nothing on the floor, nothing on the stairs. The overhead bulb was still burned out. But the emergency phone bracket, the metal plate bolted to the wall where the handset used to be, was wet. A small oval of condensation on the surface, the size and shape of someone's mouth. Fresh. The water was beating, not dried, like someone had leaned in close and breathed on it. Recently, minutes ago, seconds, I touched it. Still cold, colder than before. I went back to the desk. My hands had stopped shaking by the time I sat down, but only because I was gripping the armrests hard enough to turn my knuckles yellow. The terminal was on. The log had updated. Badge 4412, Marsh Helen R., access granted, P3 entry gate. And below it, in a log format I had never seen, a format that didn't match any field in the access control software, a line that shouldn't exist in the database schema, was a second entry. Helen R., P3 stairwell, still here. I called the security company. The overnight dispatcher picked up on the second ring. I told her I was done. I told her I wouldn't be coming back. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the flat tone of someone reading from a note taped to a monitor, "You're the fourth one on that site, Mr. Jessup. We'll send a replacement." I asked her what happened to the other three. She said she couldn't discuss personnel matters and wished me a good evening. I went to punch out. The time clock was at the front security desk next to the door. I pulled my time card from the slot. It was already punched. The out stamp read 2:47 a.m. 3 hours before my shift ended. I hadn't punched out. I'd been on P3 at 2:47 a.m., standing next to a gate arm that moved by itself. I didn't touch the time clock. There's only one other time clock on the campus. It's on P3, in the old parking attendant's booth. My booth. The one I sat in for 22 years, where I ate my lunch and drank my coffee and watched the gate arms go up and down all day. That clock punched my card 3 hours early from a booth I hadn't entered. I left the building. Didn't go back for my thermos. It was on the desk, and the desk was inside, and inside was where P3 was. I drove home in the fog with the windows down because the car felt too small, and I needed to hear something that wasn't concrete and silence. 3 weeks later, the security company called. A woman from HR. She asked if I'd left a notebook in the booth. I said no, I never kept a notebook. She said it had my handwriting in it. I said that was impossible. I didn't keep notes, I kept log entries, and those were on the terminal. She was quiet for a moment. Then she read me the last entry. It said, Badge 4412, 2:47 a.m. She's still here. I know because I am too. I hung up. And I try not to think about the fact that my handwriting was in a notebook I never opened, in a booth on P3 that I haven't entered since the hospital closed. But some nights, when the house is quiet and the clock ticks past 2:47 a.m., I think about the gate arm rising in the dark. I think about the condensation on that bracket, the shape of a mouth breathing on cold metal. And I wonder if she found her car. And I wonder if I really left that building. Or if some part of me is still down there on P3 writing in a notebook I don't remember buying, waiting for the badge to tap in. Badge 4412, 2:47 a.m.